in the stifling heat of August 1839, along the muddy banks of the Mississippi River, where Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds over the dark waters that had witnessed centuries of human suffering and unspeakable atrocities committed in the name of profit and racial supremacy. Madame Eveline Dequa stood on the wraparound gallery, her magnificent antebellum mansion, surveying with cold satisfaction an empire built upon the most horrific form of human commodification ever devised in the American South, a systematic breeding operation that had transformed her own 3 daughters into unwilling producers of human cattle for the insatiable cotton plantations that stretched across the Mississippi Delta like a malignant cancer, consuming everything in its path, while generating profits that exceeded the wildest dreams of conventional slave traders who dealt in human misery through more traditional methods of exploitation and degradation. If you think you know the darkest secrets of American slavery, you are about to discover horrors that will shatter every assumption you have ever had about how far human evil can descend when unlimited profit meets absolute power over other human beings. Hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel with notifications turned on, and tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from, because this story from 1839 Mississippi will haunt your dreams forever and change how you understand the true depths of systematic human exploitation that flourished in antebellum America under the protection of laws designed to maintain white supremacy at any cost. At 42 years of age, Madame Evangeline Dequa commanded one of the most profitable and morally apt enterprises in the entire antebellum South, operating what appeared to casual observers and visiting dignitaries as a respectable finishing school for young ladies of good breeding and refined social standing, but functioned in horrific reality as a carefully orchestrated human breeding facility that supplied premium mixed-race slaves to wealthy planters throughout Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, and the Carolinas, who were willing to pay extraordinary prices for enslaved people whose European features, lighter complexions, sophisticated educations, and refined mannerisms made them particularly suitable for housework, personal service, and the kinds of intimate relationships that white Southern society publicly condemned with hypocritical righteousness, while privately embracing with enthusiastic participation that generated enormous profits for those who understood how to exploit the fundamental contradiction between public morality and private desire. The Dequa estate, known throughout the river parishes and beyond as Bell Ombre, beautiful shadow, sprawled majestically across 3,000 acres of the richest Mississippi River bottomland that had been in the family for 3 generations of increasingly wealthy and influential planters. Its carefully maintained boundaries encompassing not just endless fields of pristine, white cotton that stretched to the horizon like snow-covered plains under the blazing southern sun, but also the mansion itself, a stunning architectural marvel that combined the elegant refinement of French colonial design with the imposing grandeur of Greek Revival style. Its towering white columns and sweeping double galleries, specifically designed to project an image of civilization, refinement, and Gentile prosperity that served as an elaborate facade to mask the industrial human trafficking operation that generated the family's enormous wealth through methods so depraved and morally bankrupt that even hardened professional slave traders who had spent their entire careers buying and selling human beings like livestock whispered about them in shocked and horrified tones when they thought no one else could overhear their conversating. Once Evangeline Diokwa had not been born into this life of unspeakable cruelty and systematic exploitation of human fertility for purely commercial purposes, but had instead been gradually and methodically transformed into a monster by circumstances and choices that revealed the terrifying capacity for evil that lurked within even the most seemingly civilized, educated, and refined members of Southern plantation society. When economic desperation combined with absolute power over other human beings to create opportunities for profit that can only be achieved through the complete abandonment of every moral principle, religious teaching, and ethical constraint that had once guided their behavior and defined their understanding of human dignity. Basic decency and Christian responsibility toward those less fortunate than themselves. Born Evangeline Temem to a prosperous and highly respected family of free people of color in New Orleans, whose considerable wealth had been accumulated over several generations through careful business dealings. Strategic marriages and successful navigation of Louisiana's complex racial hierarchy that offered more opportunities for advancement than existed in other southern states. She had possessed from early childhood the kind of extraordinary beauty, refined education, sophisticated social graces, a natural elegance that allowed her to pass for white in social situations where her true heritage remained unknown, unexamined, or deliberately ignored by those who found it convenient to overlook such details when substantial profits or social advantages were at stake. This carefully maintained deception became permanent and seemingly irreversible when she married Jean Baptiste de Lacroix, heir to one of Mississippi's oldest, wealthiest, and most politically influential planting families, whose ancestors had built their massive fortune through cotton cultivation and slave trading on a scale that made them among the most powerful and respected men in the entire Mississippi Delta region, their influence extending from local politics through state government to the halls of Congress, where they maintained relationships with senators and representatives who protected their interests and ensured that federal laws would not interfere with their profitable enterprises. For 15 blissful and prosperous years, her marriage to Jean Baptiste had provided her with everything that any woman in antebellum America could possibly have desired. Unquestioned social status among Mississippi's plantation elite, who accepted her as one of their own without reservation. Enormous wealth that allowed her to indulge every whim and fancy while maintaining a lifestyle of luxury that rivaled European nobility. A magnificent home that served as a showcase for imported furniture, priceless artwork, and cultural refinements that demonstrated the family's sophisticated taste and international connections, and the genuine respect and admiration of the region's most prominent families who welcomed her into their social circles and relied on her leadership in charitable activities. Cultural events and the complex social rituals that defined upper-ass Southern society. During these years of apparent happiness and social triumph, she had borne 3 beautiful daughters to Jean Baptiste: Celeste, Marguerite, and Sylvie, each inheriting their mother's extraordinary beauty. Refined mannerisms, intellectual capabilities, and natural grace, while remaining completely ignorant of the African blood that flowed through their veins and would eventually become the legal foundation for their transformation from pampered daughters of Mississippi aristocracy into enslaved, human prelude valued primarily for their reproductive capacity and the premium prices their raised offspring could command in the illegal but thriving slave markets that operated throughout the Deep South with the knowledge and protection of supposedly respectable members of society. The catastrophic transformation from respected planter's wife and social leader to human trafficking mastermind had begun in the autumn of 1837, when Jean Baptiste died suddenly and unexpectedly from yellow fever during the devastating epidemic that swept through the Mississippi Delta like the angel of death, claiming victims from every level of society while leaving behind a trail of economic destruction that would take years to repair. His death left behind not only personal grief and social displacement, but also massive financial debts that threatened to destroy everything the family had built over 3 generations of careful accumulation. Strategic investments and profitable enterprises that had seemed as secure and permanent as the mighty Mississippi River itself. The financial crisis that followed Jean Baptiste's death had been catastrophically exacerbated by the devastating economic effects of the Panic of 1837, a nationwide financial disaster that destroyed cotton prices overnight, collapsed credit markets, caused widespread bank failures, and triggered a cascade of bankruptcies that wiped out fortunes throughout the South, while leaving even the wealthiest plantation families struggling desperately to maintain their operations and social positions. In the face of economic forces beyond their control or understanding, faced with the terrifying prospect of losing Bell Ombre, being reduced to gentile poverty, and potentially having her carefully concealed racial heritage exposed during the financial investigations and legal proceedings that inevitably accompanied major bankruptcy cases involving prominent plantation properties. Evangeline had made a series of decisions that would reveal the depths of moral depravity to which even apparently civilized human beings could descend when survival seemed to require the complete abandonment of every ethical principle, religious teaching, and social constraint that had once governed their behavior. Her first horrific innovation had been to recognize that her daughter's mixed-race heritage, rather than being a shameful family secret that must be concealed at all costs to preserve their social position and marriage prospects, could instead be transformed into an extraordinarily valuable commercial asset in the South's thriving but carefully hidden market for what slave traders euphemistically called fancy girls, enslaved women whose European features, light complexions, refined educations, sophisticated social graces, and aristocratic backgrounds made them particularly desirable as concubines, personal servants, status symbols, and breeding stock for wealthy white men who were willing to pay premium prices that far exceeded the cost of ordinary field hands for human property that could simultaneously satisfy their domestic needs. Sexual appetites and desire for prestigious possessions that demonstrated their wealth and sophistication to envious peers. The complex legal mechanism that made this horrific exploitation possible was Louisiana's notoriously complicated system of racial classification, which determined an individual's legal status and social position based on the documentable percentage of African ancestry they possessed, combined with Mississippi's even more draconian laws that allowed for the enslavement of persons whose racial heritage could be established through witness testimony. Documentary evidence, expert medical opinion, or judicial determination, regardless of their previous social status, economic position, length of residence in free communities, or apparent European ancestry that might suggest white heritage to casual observers by carefully documenting her own mixed-race ancestry through a combination of forged documents. Purchased testimony and manipulated evidence while simultaneously claiming that her marriage to Jean-Baptiste had been legally invalid due to her fraudulent concealment of this racial heritage. Evangeline discovered that she could theoretically enslave her own daughters while simultaneously protecting herself from prosecution by maintaining that she had been just as deceived about their true racial status as her late husband had been, making her a victim of the same deception rather than its primary architect and beneficiary. The systematic implementation of this monstrous scheme had required months of careful planning, extensive bribery of public officials, and the corruption of numerous individuals whose cooperation was absolutely essential for legitimizing the complex series of legal proceedings that would strip her daughters of their freedom, their social status, their legal personhood, and their basic human rights, while simultaneously transferring complete ownership of their bodies. Reproductive capacity and future offspring to her own mother, who would then be legally free to exploit them in whatever manner would generate maximum profits from their systematic sexual abuse and forced breeding. Local judges had been paid substantial bribes to ignore obvious inconsistencies, legal irregularities, and procedural violations in the evidence presented support Evangeline's claims about her family's racial heritage and the invalidity of her marriage, while court clerks, record keepers, and administrative officials had been generously compensated for fabricating crucial documents, altering existing records, and creating false evidence would provide legal justification for enslaving 3 young women who had lived their entire lives as free white citizens of unquestioned social standing. Most crucially, Evangeline had secured the enthusiastic cooperation of Augusto Murier, a respected physician whose medical expertise and professional reputation provided apparently scientific legitimacy for her claims about her daughter's supposed mixed-race status, while his ongoing involvement in examining and monitoring their physical condition would protect the entire operation from kind of detailed, outside scrutiny that might expose its fundamentally fraudulent nature and purely commercial purpose. Mercier's systematic examinations of Celeste, Marguerite, and Sylvie, which he conducted with the clinical detachment and professional objectivity of a livestock veterinarian, evaluating breeding stock for potential purchases, provided detailed documentation of the physical characteristics that supposedly proved their African ancestry while simultaneously assessing their reproductive capacity, overall health, psychological temperament, intellectual abilities, and commercial value as potential breeding subjects whose offspring could be expected to command premium prices in specialized slave markets catered to discriminating buyers seeking human property that combined beauty, intelligence, refinement, and genetic characteristics that made them ideally suited for intimate personal service. By the spring of 1839, the legal and social transformation was complete and irreversible. Celeste Marguerite and Sylvia Dequa, aged 1917 and 15, respectively, had been legally reclassified from free white women of unquestioned social standing and unlimited future prospects to enslaved property owned absolutely by their own mother. Their previous lives as pampered daughters of Mississippi aristocracy systematically erased as completely as if they had never existed, their legal personhood destroyed through carefully orchestrated court proceedings that transformed them into human commodities whose value was measured entirely in terms of their reproductive potential and the profits that could be generated through their systematic sexual exploitation and the sale of their children to buyers who would treat them as property rather than human beings deserving of love, protection, and basic human dignity. As the oppressive heat of summer 1839 reached its murderous peak and storm clouds began gathering on the horizon, forces were already in motion that would soon test every assumption about human endurance. Family loyalty, maternal love, and the ultimate limits of what even the most systematically abused victims could be forced to accept before their capacity for resistance finally overcame their fear of the terrible consequences that rebellion would surely bring upon them. And anyone who dared to challenge the established order that seemed as permanent and unshakable as the ancient oak trees shaded Bell Ombre's elegant galleries. The systematic horror of Bell Ombre's human breeding operation reached its most psychologically devastating and morally depraved phase during the autumn months of 1839, when Evangeline Delacroix implemented what she euphemistically referred to in her private correspondence as her productivity enhancement program, a series of increasingly brutal, sophisticated, and scientifically designed measures specifically created to maximize the reproductive output of her enslaved daughters while simultaneously breaking down the last stubborn vestiges of psychological resistance. Family loyalty and human dignity that might threaten the continued success and extraordinary profitability of her carefully constructed empire of human commodification had already generated wealth exceeding anything that could be achieved through conventional cotton cultivation, traditional slave trading methods, or any other legal enterprise available to antebellum plantation owners seeking to maximize their returns on investment through the systematic exploitation of human labor and reproductive capacity. The psychological warfare she systematically and methodically waged against 19-year-old Celeste, 17-year-old Marguerite, and 15-year-old Sylvia during these crucial months would prove so devastatingly effective and scientifically precise that even hardened professional slave traders, experienced plantation overseers, and visiting physicians who came to Bell Ombre to inspect potential purchases and evaluate the quality of the breeding program's human products expressed private concern, earn and professional admiration about the hollow-eyed desperation, broken spirits, and apparent complete submission they observed in three young women who had once been universally recognized throughout Mississippi society as among the region's most beautiful, accomplished, intellectually gifted, and socially prominent belles before their legal transformation into human breeding stock, valued primarily for their reproductive capacity and the premium prices their mixed-race offspring could command in specialized slave markets throughout the Deep South. The complete and irreversible transformation of her daughters from free white women of unquestioned social standing, unlimited future prospects, and protected legal status to enslaved reproductive property, subject to whatever treatment their owner deemed necessary for maintaining discipline and maximizing commercial profits, had been accomplished through a masterful combination of legal manipulation, systematic psychological abuse, carefully orchestrated social isolation, physical intimidation, and emotional terrorism that demonstrated Evangeline's remarkable and terrifying understanding of precisely how to destroy human dignity. Individual identity, family bonds, and psychological resistance while maintaining the physical health. Attractive appearance, cooperative demeanor, and reproductive functionality necessary for successful breeding operations and the production of valuable mixed-race offspring who could command premium prices in specialized markets that catered to wealthy buyers seeking human property for intimate personal service. Each daughter had been assigned a specific and carefully defined role within the breeding operation based on detailed evaluations of her individual age. Physical characteristics. Psychological temperament, assessed reproductive potential, projected commercial value, and anticipated appeal to different categories of wealthy clients who paid substantial fees for access to premium breeding subjects whose European features. Refined educations and aristocratic backgrounds made them far more desirable, able than ordinary enslaved women who lack such advantageous characteristics and cultural refinements that enhance their commercial value in specialized markets. Their daily routines. Social interactions. Personal activities. Dietary requirements. Exercise regimens. Educational pursuits. And even their most intimate bodily functions had been carefully orchestrated and continuously monitored to maximize their effectiveness as human livestock while preventing the formation of emotional bonds, mutual support systems, resistance networks, or coordinated escape attempts that might threaten the operation's continued profitability. Security and success in maintaining the carefully constructed facade of respectability that protected it from official scrutiny or interference from law enforcement authorities who might be motivated by moral concerns or legal obligations to investigate reports of legal human trafficking activities. Celeste. At 19, the eldest and initially the most psychologically resilient of the three sisters, had been designated as the premium breeding subject, whose offspring would command the highest prices in specialized slave markets due to her exceptional beauty. Refined mannerisms. Sophisticated education. Natural grace. An aristocratic bearing that remained largely intact despite months of systematic degradation, humiliation, sexual exploitation, and psychological abuse designed to break her spirit while preserving her commercial value as breeding stock capable of producing children who would inherit her most desirable physical and intellectual characteristics, her living quarters, while luxuriously appointed with fine furniture, elegant clothing, imported books, musical instruments, and cultural amenities, specifically chosen to maintain her aesthetic appeal and intellectual sophistication for potential breeding partners who valued refinement and education in their temporary companions, had been subtly but effectively modified with sophisticated security measures, including hidden locks, reinforced windows, monitoring devices, and alarm systems that prevented escape attempts while rating and maintaining the crafted illusion of voluntary participation in activities that any rational outside observer would immediately recognize as systematic rays, specifically designed to produce human commodities for sale in illegal markets that operated with the knowledge and protection of supposedly respectable members of Southern society. The selection process for Celeste's breeding partners had been handled with the calculating precision. Scientific methodology and attention to detail typically associated with professional livestock breeding programs designed to produce animals with specific desirable characteristics. With Dreher, August Murrier maintaining comprehensive written records of each participating man's physical characteristics, family medical history, genetic compatibility, as determined by his questionable pseudoscientific theories about racial mixing and inherited traits. Financial resources, social standing, political connections, and potential for producing offspring with the specific combinations of European and African features that commanded the highest prices in specialized slave markets that catered to discriminating buyers seeking human property for house service, personal attendance, and intimate relationships. Wealthy planters from across the Mississippi Delta, traveling businessmen whose commercial activities brought them through the region on regular schedules, respected professionals including lawyers and physicians seeking discreet entertainment, and even prominent members of the clergy who rationalized their participation as efforts to improve the moral condition of enslaved people through Christian influence, paid substantial fees ranging from $500 to $1,500 for the exclusive privilege of participating in what they understood to be a highly selective breeding program that would produce children combining European intelligence, refinement, and physical beauty with the supposed resilience, docility, and natural submissiveness that racial theorists claimed were characteristic of individuals with African ancestry. The sophisticated psychological manipulation required to maintain Celeste's apparent cooperation and willing participation in this horrific system revealed the true depths of Evangeline's capacity for calculated evil and systematic cruelty, as she had developed and continuously refined techniques for alternating between the displays of maternal affection and calculated punishment that kept her eldest daughter emotionally dependent and psychologically vulnerable, while preventing the kind of complete mental breakdown that might reduce her commercial value as breeding stock or interfere with her ability to attract and satisfy the wealthy clients who paid premium prices for access to her reproductive capacity and intimate companionship. False promises about eventual freedom, improved living conditions, and reunion with future children were carefully timed to coincide with periods of particular despair and resistance, while strategic displays of motherly concern, affection, and apparent regret for the necessity of their current circumstances were designed to reinforce emotional dependency and prevent the development of the kind of hardened hatred that might motivate desperate resistance attempts or coordinated rebellion that could threaten the entire operation's security and profitability. These manipulative displays of maternal care were systematically balanced against explicit threats of immediate sale to the most brutal cotton plantations in the Deep South, permanent separation from her younger sisters, physical punishment specifically designed to target her deepest fears and psychological vulnerabilities, and detailed descriptions of the fate that awaited uncooperative breeding subjects who failed to maintain the standards of behavior and performance expected from premium human property. Valued at thousands of dollars in specialized markets, Marguerite at 17, possessing a more delicate physical constitution, but equally striking beauty enhanced by exceptional artistic talents, musical abilities, and intellectual accomplishments that had been carefully cultivated during her privileged upbringing as a daughter of Mississippi aristocracy, had been assigned a slightly different, but equally exploitative role within the breeding program that took strategic advantage of her cultural refinement, artistic sensibilities, and intellectual sophistication to attract clients who particularly valued educational accomplishments and creative abilities in their human property, viewing such qualities as evidence of superior breeding. Genetic potential and social status that enhanced their own prestige through association with enslaved people who possessed characteristics typically associated with the upper classes of European society. Her ongoing education in piano performance, oil painting, French literature, classical poetry, and European history had been continued under carefully controlled circumstances that maintained and enhanced her intellectual development while ensuring that these accomplishments served the commercial purposes of the breeding operation rather than providing potential avenues for resistance, escape, or communication with outside authorities who might be sympathetic to her situation and willing to intervene on her behalf. Despite the legal obstacles and social pressures that protected the operation from official interference. Private tutors, carefully selected for their discretion and willingness to ignore the obvious moral implications of their participation in human trafficking, provided advanced instruction in subjects that would enhance Margaret's appeal to educated clients, while simultaneously monitoring her behavior, emotional state, and potential for resistance that might threaten the operation's security or success in maintaining the facade of voluntary participation that protected it from legal scrutiny. The 17-year-old's breeding schedule had been carefully coordinated with her older sister's reproductive cycle to ensure continuous productivity and predictable income streams while minimizing the medical risks and logistical complications associated with overlapping pregnancies that might strain Mercier's ability to provide adequate prenatal care, monitor the health of both mothers and developing fetuses, and manage the complex delivery procedures that would maximize the survival rates of valuable infants, destined for sale in premium slave markets where healthy children with desirable physical characteristics could command prices ranging from $2 to $4,000, depending on their apparent intelligence and genetic potential. The systematic nature of this reproductive coordination reflected Evangeline's exceptional business acumen and her sophisticated understanding that successful human trafficking required the same kind of operational planning. Resource management, quality control, and strategic thinking that characterized any profitable commercial enterprise, regardless of the moral implications of treating human reproduction as an industrial process designed to generate maximum returns on investment through the systematic exploitation of her own daughters' bodies and reproductive capacity for purely commercial purposes. Sylvie, the youngest at 15, had initially been held in reserve while her body matured to the point where pregnancy would be medically safe and commercially viable. But Evangeline's growing financial pressures Combined with increasing market demand for premium mixed-race slaves and the extraordinary profits generated by her older sister's successful pregnancies, had led to her premature inclusion in the breeding program before her physical and emotional development had reached levels that would have made such exploitation less dangerous to her long-term health and psychological well-being. The psychological preparation required to break a 15-year-old's natural resistance to systematic sexual exploitation and reproductive abuse had demanded even more sophisticated manipulation. Careful planning and systematic cruelty than had been necessary with her older sisters, combining carefully crafted appeals to family loyalty and sisterly devotion with explicit threats against her siblings' welfare that made compliance and cooperation seem like a protection and sacrifice rather than simple abuse and reproductive exploitation designed to generate profits for their mother's commercial enterprise. This story takes an even more shocking and disturbing turn from here. So, make sure you are subscribed with notifications turned on, because you won't believe how these sisters begin to fight back against the ultimate maternal betrayal that violated every natural law of family protection and human decency. Hit that like button if you are amazed by these untold stories of survival against impossible odds. And tell me in the comments what other hidden horrors of American history you want me to expose and bring to light for modern audiences who need to understand the true depths of systematic human exploitation that flourished under legal protection in antebellum America. As winter approached, and the first pregnancies from the expanded breeding program began to show visible results that would soon produce valuable human commodities for sale in specialized markets throughout the Deep South, dangerous tensions within Bell Ombre started to escalate beyond Evangeline's ability to control through her usual combination of psychological manipulation, false promises, and carefully calibrated physical coercion that had previously maintained her daughter's apparent compliance, hence with the systematic sexual exploitation that generated enormous wealth for the family while destroying their dignity, identity, and hope for any future beyond their current enslavement to their mother's profitable but morally bankrupt corrupt commercial enterprise that treated human reproduction as just another business opportunity to be exploited for maximum financial gain. The moment of ultimate reckoning and divine retribution arrived on a bitter cold January morning in 1840 when 19-year-old Celeste Delacroix gave birth to her first child in the elegant bedroom that had been systematically converted into a sterile medical facility specifically designed for the industrial production of mixed-race infants destined for immediate sale in premium slave markets throughout the Deep South. A son whose fair complexion, delicate European features, obvious intelligence reflected in bright, alert eyes, and unmistakable signs of aristocratic breeding, represented not the triumphant culmination of her mother's profitable breeding program, but rather the catalyst that would trigger the most shocking, violent, and psychologically devastating act of maternal rebellion in the entire documented history of American slavery, transforming 3 systematically abused daughters who had been reduced to the status of human breeding into instruments of divine retribution against the woman who had traded their freedom, dignity, bodily autonomy, and reproductive capacity for profit margins that exceeded the wildest fantasies of conventional slave traders throughout the Mississippi Delta region and beyond. The infant's first piercing cries echoing through the corridors of Bell Ombre's elegant mansion would mark the beginning of a desperate campaign of coordinated resistance, carefully planned violence, and systematic revenge that would transform the gracious antebellum estate from a center of systematic human exploitation disguised as Gentile Southern hospitality into a battlefield where the fundamental assumptions about power, authority, family loyalty, maternal love, and the supposed limits of human endurance in the face of unspeakable oppression would be tested through life and death struggle that would expose the moral bankruptcy. Systematic corruption and inherent contradictions underlying even the most apparently civilized segments of Southern plantation society that had built their wealth and social status on the systematic dehumanization of enslaved people. Targust Murrier, who had overseen Celeste's pregnancy with the clinical precision, emotional detachment, and professional objectivity of an experienced livestock breeder monitoring valuable breeding stock through the reproductive process, pronounced the birth medically successful according to all relevant health indicators, and immediately prepared to implement the standard operational protocol that had been carefully developed and refined through previous cases, which required the separation of mother from child within hours of delivery to prevent the formation of emotional bonds that might interfere with future reproductive cycles, reduce the mother's commercial value as breeding stock, or create psychological complications that could threaten the continued profitability and operational efficiency of the breeding program that had made Bell Ombre one of the most lucrative human trafficking operations in the entire Mississippi Delta region. But as Dr. Mercier reached with practiced efficiency for the newborn infant to begin the carefully rehearsed process that would transform an innocent child into a commodity valued at nearly $3,000 in Mississippi's illegal but thriving slave markets operated with the knowledge and protection of supposedly respectable members of society. He encountered resistance from Celeste that exceeded anything he had witnessed, anticipated, or prepared for during months of systematic abuse. Psychological manipulation, reproductive exploitation, and apparent complete submission that had seemed to break her spirit entirely, while transforming her from a pampered daughter of Mississippi aristocracy into compliant breeding stock, valued primarily for her reproductive capacity and commercial potential. The young woman, who had once been universally recognized throughout Southern society as one of the region's most refined, accomplished, intellectually gifted, and socially prominent belles, had been transformed by months of systematic brutalization, sexual exploitation, and psychological terrorism into something far more dangerous than her oppressors had ever imagined possible. A mother whose natural protective instincts had been sharpened rather than dulled by suffering, whose desperation had reached levels that made death preferable to continued compliance, and whose accumulated rage had finally overcome her fear of consequences in the face of an act so fundamentally evil that it violated every natural law of maternal protection and human decency that defined civilized behavior, regardless of legal status or racial classification. "You will not take my son from me," Celeste declared with quiet authority, her voice carrying a determination and strength that had been completely absent during months of apparent submission to the breeding programs. Horrific requirements, her words resonating with the kind of primal maternal power that transcended legal categories of slave and free, property and person, creating a moment of absolute moral clarity that cut through all the sophisticated legal arguments and pseudoscientific justifications that had been used to legitimize her systematic exploitation. I have given you my body, my freedom, my dignity, my very soul, and every hope I ever had for a normal life. But I will not give you my child if you attempt to remove him from this room. I swear before Almighty God and all the saints in heaven that I will kill both myself and this innocent baby, rather than allow you to sell another human being created from my flesh and blood to serve the twisted appetites and perverted desires of men who view it as commodities to be purchased for their own pleasure and profit. The confrontation that erupted in response to this unprecedented act of defiance and maternal rebellion would expose the fundamental weakness and inherent instability in Evangeline's carefully constructed system of psychological control, revealing that even the most sophisticated, scientifically designed, and systematically implemented techniques for breaking human resistance could be overcome by maternal instincts, powerful enough to transform victims into agents of their own liberation, when the stakes involved the welfare of innocent children who represented hope for a future free from the systematic exploitation, degradation, and commodification had defined their own existence under the brutal regime that treated human reproduction as just another business opportunity to be maximized for profit. Dr. Murrier's desperate attempts to sedate Celeste and proceed with the planned separation according to the established protocols that had proven successful in previous cases were met with physical violence that demonstrated how completely her months of apparent compliance and submission had been replaced by desperate determination to protect her child regardless of the personal consequences such protection might require. Including her own death and that of the infant, she clutched protectively against her breast, while preparing to fight to the death against anyone who attempted to separate them for commercial purposes. Marguerite and Sylvie, who had been summoned to witness what was intended to be a routine transfer of valuable human property from mother to commercial inventory, according to the standard procedures that had been refined through months of operational experience, instead found themselves confronting the shocking reality that their eldest sister's transformation from victim to active resistor offered them their first genuine opportunity to escape the breeding program that had consumed their lives, destroyed their identities, and reduced them to the status of human livestock, valued primarily for their reproductive capacity and the premium prices their mixed-race offspring could command in specialized markets that catered to wealthy buyers seeking human property for intimate personal service. The sight of Celeste holding her newborn son, while threatening to kill both herself and the child, rather than submit to further systematic exploitation, created a moment of absolute clarity that cut through months of psychological manipulation, false promises, and carefully crafted illusions, revealing the stark choice between continued enslavement to their mother's profitable breeding operation and desperate resistance that offered the possibility of freedom, even if it came at the ultimate price of their own lives and the destruction of everyone responsible for their systematic abuse and exploitation. The sisters' instantaneous decision to support Celeste's rebellion rather than attempting to calm her down and preserve their own relative safety within the existing system marked the beginning of a coordinated uprising that would draw upon every resource they possessed. Their intimate knowledge of Bell Ombre's architectural layout, security procedures, and operational vulnerabilities, their sophisticated understanding of their mother's psychological weaknesses, businesses, relationships, and financial dependencies, and most importantly, their accumulated rage over months of systematic abuse that had been building pressure like steam in a boiler until the moment when explosion became not just inevitable, but necessary for their very survival as human beings rather than commercial property. Evangeline's response to her daughter's unprecedented rebellion revealed her absolute commitment to maintaining the breeding program that had made her wealthy beyond her wildest dreams and transformed her from financial ruin into one of Mississippi's most profitable human trafficking operations. And her fundamental miscalculation about the ultimate limits of what human beings could be forced to endure before their capacity for resistance finally overcame their fear of the terrible consequences that defiance would surely bring upon them, and anyone who dared to challenge the established order that had seemed as permanent and unshakable as the mighty Mississippi River itself. Rather than attempting to negotiate with her daughters or address their concerns through compromise, concessions, or promises of improved treatment that might have diffused the situation and preserved her valuable human property, Evangeline chose to escalate the confrontation by summoning the plantation's armed overseers and threatening to have all three girls physically restrained and forcibly separated from the newborn infant. A decision that would transform what might have been a temporary crisis, manageable through her usual combination of manipulation and false promises, into a life-or-death struggle between mother and daughters that could only end with the complete victory of one side and the total destruction of the other. The explosive violence that erupted when the heavily armed overseers attempted to implement Evangeline's orders shocked even Dreher. Mercier, whose years of active participation in the breeding program had accustomed him to witnessing systematic brutality against young women who had once been his social equals, but had been legally transformed into human property, subject to whatever treatment their owner deemed necessary for maintaining discipline and maximizing profits from their reproductive exploitation and the sale of their children to buyers who would treat them as commodities rate her than human beings deserving of love and protection. Celeste's willingness to use her own body as a weapon against men twice her size who were armed with whips, clubs, and restraining devices, Margaret's desperate attempts to protect her sister, while simultaneously defending the newborn infant, whose cries filled the air with sounds of innocence under assault, and 15-year-old Sylve's shocking transformation from terrified child to fierce defender of her family demonstrated how completely their apparent submission had been replaced by the kind of desperate courage and coordinated determination that made them far more dangerous than their oppressors had ever imagined possible. The standoff that developed over the following hours would test every assumption about power relationships within the plantation system as three young women, armed with nothing but desperate determination, maternal instincts, accumulated rage, and intimate knowledge of their oppressors' vulnerabilities, faced off against a network of adults whose economic interests, legal authority, physical advantages, and access to weapons seemed to make their victory inevitable, but who had fatally underestimated the power of human beings who had finally reached the point where death was preferable to continued compliance with systematic dehumanization. The psychological warfare that had once kept the sisters compliant now worked in reverse as their intimate knowledge of their oppressors' fears, vulnerabilities, guilty secrets, businesses, relationships, and psychological pressure points provided weapons that could be used to maximum effect in a battle where conventional concepts of physical strength, legal authority, and economic power meant nothing compared to the moral authority of mothers defending their children and the desperate courage of human beings who had finally chosen freedom over survival. Evangeline's frantic attempts to regain control through her usual combination of maternal manipulation, false promises of improved conditions, and calculated threats of severe punishment proved completely ineffective against daughters who had finally understood that their mother's pledges about temporary arrangements and eventual freedom were lies designed to maintain their cooperation with a system that would never voluntarily release them from bondage or allow them to keep the children who were being systematically stolen from the hail for the highest biders in markets that treated human beings as commodities. The revelation that she had never intended to honor any of her promises about improving their living conditions, reducing their breeding obligations, or allowing them contact with their offspring, had stripped away the last vestiges of filial loyalty that might have prevented them from treating her as the enemy she had always been. Despite the biological relationship that made their conflict particularly tragic and their ultimate confrontation both inevitable and necessary for their survival as human beings, rather than commercial property. The turning point came when Celeste announced that she possessed detailed information about her mother's business relationships, illegal activities, corrupt officials, and wealthy clients that could destroy not only the breeding program, but also expose the entire network of plantation owners, merchants, politicians, and professional men whose participation in systematic rape and human trafficking had been protected by carefully maintained secrecy and mutually beneficial corruption that extended throughout Mississippi's political and social establishment at every level from local courts to state government. When the final battle began in Bell Ombre's elegant parlor, 3 young women would either win their freedom through violence or die in the attempt, knowing that failure would mean not only their own destruction, but the continued enslavement and exploitation of countless other victims who might have been saved if their desperate rebellion had succeeded in exposing the truth about the systematic horrors that flourished behind facades of civilization and respectability. The aftermath of the Bell Ombre massacre sent shock waves through Mississippi's plantation society that would reverberate for decades to come, fundamentally altering how the state's political, social, and economic elite understood the dangerous limits of human endurance and the terrible consequences that could result when the relentless pursuit of profit through systematic human exploitation pushed enslaved people beyond their capacity to submit to dehumanization that violated every natural instinct of self-preservation, parental protection, and basic human dignity that define the essential characteristics of civilized society, regardless of race, legal status, or social position within the rigidly hierarchical structures that governed an antebellum American life and maintained white supremacy through whatever means proved necessary, including the most brutal forms of violence and systematic oppression that had ever been devised by supposedly Christian people claiming to represent the pinnacle of human civilization and moral development. The horrific scene that confronted local authorities when they finally arrived at the Delaware estate 3 days after the violence ended presented a tableau of destruction, carnage, and moral reckoning that challenged every fundamental assumption about power relationships, family loyalty, maternal love, and the supposed benefits of slavery, while simultaneously exposing the moral bankruptcy. Systematic corruption and inherent contradictions that had allowed such unspeakable horrors to flourish under the protection of legal institutions and social customs specifically designed to maintain white supremacy through whatever methods proved most effective regardless of the human costs involved or the long-term consequences for Southern society's claims to Christian morality, civilized behavior, and cultural superiority over other regions of the United States, where such systematic exploitation was viewed with horror and disgust. Evangeline Delacroix's mutilated and lifeless body was discovered in her elegant parlor, surrounded by the shattered remnants of imported European furniture. Priceless artwork, luxury goods, and cultural artifacts that had once symbolized her family's wealth, social status, and supposed refinement, but now served as silent witnesses to the final confrontation between a mother who had systematically sold her daughter's freedom, dignity, and reproductive autonomy for profit, and the children who had chosen death over continued enslavement to her twisted business enterprise that had generated enormous wealth through the systematic commodification of human reproduction and the sale of innocent infants in illegal markets throughout the Deep South that operated with the knowledge, protection, and active participation of supposedly respectable members of society who claimed to be guided by Christian principles and moral values. The manner of her death, beaten to death with a marble statue of the Virgin Mary that had been a wedding gift from her late husband and positioned prominently in the parlor as a symbol of Christian faith. Maternal devotion and family values would be interpreted by some observers throughout the region as divine justice for crimes that had violated every principle of Christian morality. Natural law, basic human decency, and maternal responsibility, while others viewed it as evidence of the savage brutality and inherent violence that they claimed was characteristic of African blood, regardless of how many generations it had been diluted through mixture with European ancestry, or how refined the education and social training that had been provided to individuals of mixed racial heritage. August Murrier was found dead in the mansion's medical examination room, his skull crushed by the same instruments he had used for months to evaluate the reproductive capacity. Commercial potential, and genetic characteristics of young women. He had helped transform from free citizens into human breeding stock, while two of the plantation's overseers lay dead in the hallway outside Celeste's birthing chamber, their bodies bearing evidence of the desperate and ultimately successful resistance they had encountered when attempting to separate a mother from her newborn child in service of a commercial enterprise that valued infant humans as commodities to be sold for maximum profit to buyers who would treat them as property rather than human beings deserving of love, protection, and basic human dignity. The third overseer, badly wounded but still alive when help finally arrived. After 3 days of searching by concerned neighbors, who had noticed the unusual silence from a plantation that normally buzzed with activity, would spend the remainder of his life telling anyone willing to listen about the shocking transformation he had witnessed as 3 pampered Southern belles became capable of lethal violence when their maternal instincts, accumulated rage, and desperate determination finally overcame their fear of consequences, proving that even the most systematic psychological manipulation Physical intimidation and economic coercion could be overcome by human beings who had finally reached the point where death was preferable to continued compliance with their own dehumanization and the systematic abuse of their children. The three sisters themselves had vanished without leaving any trace of their escape route, ultimate destination, or the assistance they may have received from sympathizers, underground railroad operators, or abolitionists who might have been monitoring the situation at Bell Ombre and prepared to help them reach safety in free territory, taking with them not only Celeste's newborn son, but also a carefully compiled collection of documents. Correspondence, financial records, client lists, and other evidence that would prove devastatingly incriminating to Mississippi's plantation elite if such materials ever surfaced in the wrong hands or were presented to federal authorities who had been investigating illegal slave breeding operations throughout the Deep South as part of their ongoing efforts to suppress the international slave trade that had been officially prohibited by federal law since 1808. But continued to flourish through domestic breeding programs that violated the spirit, if not the letter, of anti-trafficking legislation. The comprehensive records they had secretly assembled during months of apparent submission to the breeding program included detailed information about dozens of wealthy and prominent men who had participated in systematic rape disguised as legitimate commercial breeding arrangements. Extensive correspondence that revealed the network of corruption involving judges, court clerks, law enforcement officials, politicians, and business leaders whose cooperation had been essential to protecting illegal human trafficking operations from official scrutiny, and detailed financial documentation that exposed the enormous profits generated through the systematic commodification of human reproduction on a scale that exceeded anything previously documented in the long and shameful history of American slavery and human trafficking operations. The official investigation that followed the discovery of the massacre was hampered from the very beginning by the determined efforts of powerful political and economic interests throughout Mississippi suppress any information that might expose their own involvement in activities that violated numerous state and federal laws governing the slave trade, while simultaneously maintaining the public fiction. The violence at Bell Ombre had resulted from a spontaneous uprising by mentally unstable enslaved people, rather than a carefully planned rebellion against systematic sexual exploitation that had been operating with the full knowledge and active protection of the state's most respected citizens, including judges, politicians, business leaders, and religious authorities who had participated directly in the breeding program or profited indirectly from its success. Local newspapers throughout Mississippi and neighboring states were subjected to intense pressure from advertisers, subscribers, political allies, and economic partners to minimize their coverage of the incident and avoid any detailed reporting that might raise uncomfortable questions about the true nature of Bell Ombre's operations. The identity of prominent men who had been regular visitors to the plantation for commercial breeding purposes, or the extent of official corruption that had allowed such systematic human trafficking to flourish under legal protection, while law enforcement authorities at both state and federal levels focused their efforts primarily on capturing the escaped sisters, rather than investigating the extensive network of clients, officials, and business associates whose cooperation had been essential to the breeding program's remarkable success and extraordinary profitability over several years of operation. The massive manhunt that ensued would become one of the most extensive, expensive, and ultimately unsuccessful fugitive slave operations in Mississippi's entire history, involving federal marshals, professional slave catchers, private investigators hired by wealthy planters who feared exposure of their participation in illegal breeding programs, bounty hunters attracted by rewards totaling more than $10,000 that were offered for information leading to the sisters' capture and returned her to Mississippi in coordinated search efforts that extended from the Gulf Coast to the Canadian border as authorities attempted to track 3 young women who had apparently vanished as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them along with the dangerous secrets they carried about Mississippi's most prominent families. Wanted notices describing their appearance, warning about their dangerous nature, and offering substantial rewards for information leading to their apprehension were distributed throughout the Deep South and as far north as Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, and Massachusetts, where Underground Railroad operators, abolitionist organizations, and anti-slavery societies were known to assist escaped slaves seeking freedom in Canada or other safe havens, where American law could not reach them, and where their testimony about systematic human trafficking might be used to support legal and political efforts to abolish slavery throughout the United States and expose the corruption that protected such operations from official intervention. But the 3 sisters had vanished as completely and mysteriously as if they had never existed, leaving behind only unconfirmed rumors, questionable sightings, and contradictory reports that suggested they might have successfully reached free territory despite the massive resources devoted to their recapture and the enormous financial incentives offered to anyone who could provide information about their whereabouts or assist in their apprehension, and return to Mississippi for trial, execution, and the recovery of valuable human property that represented substantial financial losses for their former owner's estate and the broader network of investors who had participated in the breeding program's operations. Some witnesses claimed to have seen 3 young women, matching their description, boarding a steamboat bound for New Orleans in the company of well-dressed individuals who might have been abolitionists, Underground Railroad conductors, or sympathetic free people of color, while others reported encounters with mysterious travelers who carried a newborn infant and possessed the kind of refined mannerisms, educated speech, and aristocratic bearing that marked them as former members of Mississippi's planter us. Despite their obvious efforts to disguise their identities and conceal their true origins from casual observers who might recognize them from newspaper descriptions or wanted posters, the truth about their escape wrote, the assistance they may have received from Underground Railroad operators or sympathetic abolitionists, the false identities they may have assumed, and their ultimate destination would remain one of the antebellum period's most enduring and fascinating mysteries. Though certain Underground Railroad conductors would later hint in their memoirs and correspondence that they had assisted unusual refugees whose extraordinary story challenged every assumption about race, class, family relationships, fans, and the nature of resistance in American society, while demonstrating that even the most systematic and scientifically designed oppression could be overcome through desperate courage, careful planning, and the willingness to accept terrible personal costs in pursuit of freedom that might benefit future generations. The legal proceedings that followed the Bell Ombre massacre revealed the extraordinary length to which Mississippi's political and judicial establishment would go to protect the reputations of prominent citizens whose involvement in illegal slave breeding operations could not be completely concealed, but whose prosecution would have exposed the systematic corruption that had allowed such enterprises to flourish under official protection, while generating enormous profits for participants at every level of society, from individual plantation owners and professional men to judges, politicians, and business leaders who had profited directly or indirectly from human trafficking operations. Grand jury investigations were repeatedly delayed due to mysterious procedural complications. Scheduling conflicts and administrative difficulties. While crucial evidence disappeared from court files under circumstances that were never adequately explained or investigated, potential witnesses developed sudden cases of amnesia, left the state for extended business trips, or died unexpectedly before they could provide testimony that might have implicated respected members of the community in activities that even the most ardent defenders of slavery found difficult to justify or defend in public forums, where their reputations and social standing might be damaged by association with systematic sexual exploitation and child trafficking. Before we conclude this incredible but deeply disturbing story of ultimate maternal betrayal and the desperate resistance it provoked, make sure you are subscribed with notifications turned on so you never miss another episode of America's Hidden History. The talent challenges everything we thought we knew about the past and exposes truths that powerful interests have tried to suppress for generations. If this tale of courage in the face of unimaginable evil moved you to think differently about human resilience, the price of freedom, and the moral compromises that allowed slavery to flourish, smash that like button and tell me in the comments what other buried truths about American slavery you want me to bring to light and would examine the same unflinching honesty that these stories demand. The long-term legacy of the Delacroix Sisters' rebellion would extend far beyond their individual story to influence the broader development of resistance movements, underground railroad operations, and abolitionist propaganda that used their example to demonstrate that slavery contained within itself contradictions and moral contradictions that made its ultimate destruction inevitable, while their willingness to accept terrible personal costs in pursuit of freedom provided inspiration for countless others who faced similar choices between submission and resistance in their own struggles against systematic oppression. Dehumanization and the commodification of human life that characterized American slavery at its most brutal and morally bankrupt extremes, proving that human dignity and the capacity for resistance could survive even the most sophisticated attempts to destroy them through systematic abuse and psychological manipulation designed to reduce human beings to the status of commercial property valued only for their economic productivity and reproductive capacity.